Volcker's success as the slayer of inflation came at a huge cost. Heading up the U.S. Central Bank, the late Paul Volcker helped control the rampant inflation of the 1980s, and went on to warn in 2005 about the threat of runaway borrowing, writes Kyran Fitzgerald.Paul Volcker, the former head of the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Central Bank, died last week at the age of 92. He was an immense figure who almost single-handedly transformed the fortunes of the economies of the Western world. He did so by shaking inflation out of the system through a mixture of rigorous thinking and political courage at a time, the late 1970s, when instability was rampant. His actions also caused considerable short-term pain for countries like Ireland, which relied on overseas borrowings to maintain their existing standard of living. In 1979, in an act of real statesmanship, President Jimmy Carter appointed Mr. Volcker to the post of chairman of the Federal Reserve. He did so at a time when inflation was out of control. Mr. Volcker's response was to rapidly tighten monetary policy in an effort to reverse the inflationary tide. This spelled bad news indeed for countries like Ireland, which had borrowed heavily in dollars to fund large public deficits. The first consequence of Mr. Volcker's tightening was a surge in interest rates on borrowed money. The second, which came in relatively quick time, was a surge in the value of the dollar as confidence in the management of the American economy was restored. It took time for Mr. Volcker to slay the beast. Inflation peaked at just under 15% in March 1980. Younger people do not realize just how much disruption such an ongoing rise in prices across the board entailed. True, many must deal with the reality of soaring rents. That gives you some idea. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, elderly people on fixed incomes looked on as their living standards tanked. In the workplace, it was the strong and the well-placed, in key industries, in often militant unions who won out at the expense of the majority. The inflationary climate resulted in a free-for-all which penalized the thrifty and the relatively powerless. Mr. Volcker began the turning of the tide, but at a huge cost to communities reliant on old-style manufacturing. Unemployment soared past 10%. Many towns, particularly in the Northeast and Midwest of America, were wiped out. The seeds of Donald Trump's 2016 victory were sown. Much of that damaging shakeout was the result of the complacency of managers who underestimated the threat from places like Japan to their industries. The huge cost of the Vietnam War also undermined the U.S. economy, while a surge in demand for oil products left the West exposed when the Middle East exploded in 1973. In Britain, Margaret Thatcher's Tories followed Mr. Volcker in jacking up the cost of money so as to squeeze inflation and unemployment. They jumped to OVE. For more on this story, visit the news article link.